Welcome to the newest episode of my think tank, where I'm continuing with this series of basically cultural differences, or in general differences in between Europe and USA. Now, that ties into geopolitical situation and how things are developing, but this young man has very interesting point of view, so let's hear him.
The first time I visited Europe, I had no idea what to expect. Well, that's kind of a lie. I did have some semblance of an expectation for what Europe would be like. You see, growing up, I had been led to believe, I had been conditioned to believe that the United States of America was unequivocally the greatest country on earth, and every other country was vying for second place. And every European country was no exception to that rule. So when I booked my flight from LAX, Los Angeles, to Valencia, Spain, a city that I had never even heard of prior to my girlfriend moving there, I fully expected Valencia to be a drastic downgrade from LA and the rest of the US as a whole. And then I actually landed. And when I landed in Valencia, it was nighttime, so I couldn't really see
I
much of the
actually
city from the
landed.
plane. But as soon as I got in the taxi and started heading over to Senator Park Central Hotel, I knew immediately that everything that I had been taught to believe about other countries was completely and utterly wrong. Some of the first few things I noticed being in Valencia were, first of all, the infrastructure. The infrastructure immediately stood out to me. I remember being in that taxi, and again, it's nighttime, so I can't see very much, but being in that taxi, taking that probably 20-ish to maybe 30-minute drive to the hotel, and not feeling any potholes along the way. And I remember thinking, wow, that's pretty interesting because there is nowhere that I've been to in the US that is devoid of potholes. So I'm thinking, okay, Spain.
Yeah, that's something I'm noticing as well. I mean, there are more potholes than in Yugoslavia before the breakup of Yugoslavia. It's just horrible. Why is like that? I mean, uh, because of that American kind of do not pay taxes because government is bad, and taxes are paying for roads. But there's another. They kind of oversized everything made. All the roads are oversized. Why the hell you need so much roads? Of course you could not then upkeep it. I suppose money, yeah. You make money while making more area of it, but you do not make money by upkeeping it. All is business.
Or at least this place, this stretch of road in this particular city in Europe doesn't seem to have any potholes. That's interesting. And I also noticed that the lines in the road were more clear. And the next day I woke up and I walked outside and I realized, wow, all of the infrastructure is better. They have dedicated bike lanes. They have this whole bike share system in that particular city. The buildings seem like they're more well maintained. And just all of the infrastructure in general, even down to the parks, they all looked better than what I was accustomed to seeing in the US. And not only that, but the urban planning was better. You see, there's no point in having bike lanes if they don't actually take you anywhere. In the US, in a lot of cities, especially the city that I grew up in, the DFW area, you can put bike lanes there, but because everything is so spread out, you can't really get anywhere with those bike lanes. So I remember being utterly surprised by the urban planning there. And this was before I found out about not just bikes and the automotive companies lobbying the politicians to implement zoning laws to prevent this more dense urban environment that's bikeable and walkable. and accessible by public transit, but we'll talk more about that later. I also noticed that the safety was on a different level. I remember, again, it was nighttime when I arrived, and my girlfriend was walking to meet me at the hotel, and I was absolutely petrified because back home, especially in a place like LA, you don't walk alone as a woman at night like that. You just don't do that. It's not in your best interest.
I mean, this is kind of an interesting point. I mean, it might be true, but however, whatever people are there in the morning and during the day are there also during the night, unless there's some kind of sleep pattern for where vampires are up at night and vampire food sleeps, something like that. Could be.
But as the days went on, with my girlfriend and I being in Valencia, I found that we could walk around safely at night and it was never really an issue. I never felt unsafe. In part because there were always more people there, but also because I knew that the threat of gun violence or violence in general was exceedingly slim. And again, as the days went on, that became more and more apparent to me. And not only that, but all of this that I just mentioned came at a lower cost of living. So not only was it a better place to be, but also it offered a lower cost of living. And mind you, I was coming from LA, so LA is obviously an extreme example, but it was a lower cost of living than anywhere that I had personally been to in the US. It was a low cost of living and a high quality of life. And of course, for people who live there, the jobs pay less. But for me, I make my money doing this. So I'm going to make the same amount of money regardless of where I am. So
Cheeky bastard.
as a digital nomad, I knew, wow, I might have been asleep on all of these other areas because if this is just this one city that I had never even heard of and it's this nice, what about all of these other places? And I took that question with me as I got back on the plane and headed back to the US via Zurich, Switzerland, which, even though I only spent 1 day in Zurich, also proved to be very, very nice. And it sort of incorporated an element of wealth that I felt like Valencia didn't really emphasize that much. And that was one thing that I was a bit concerned about with being in Europe and the collectivist mentality, which I'll also touch on later on in this video. But I was concerned that wealth was less attainable and also you just couldn't find environments that felt wealthy, that emanated wealth, like you could in LA or New York or Dallas or any other large American city. But when I went to Zurich, I was only there for around 22 hours. That fear instantly dissipated. I didn't even have to leave the airport to feel the wealth just literally radiating from all of the walls. And if you've been to Zurich, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It just emanates wealth, but also everything else that I mentioned about Valencia applied to Zurich as well. It had better infrastructure. Okay, the roads were pristine, the public transit was pristine, top.
Well, it's a small issue, but Americans generally do not know how to pronounce names in different languages, and that really sounds for everybody else who speaks other languages, except Americans who don't. This sounds really terrible. It's not Zurich, it's Zurich, Zurich in German, and I don't want to go about my name. That's just horrible.
Notch. The urban planning was immaculate, and the safety was off the charts. In fact, I think Zurich is statistically one of the safest cities in the whole entire world. The cost of living wasn't exactly very low, but it didn't seem any higher than what I was accustomed to in the US. So
So in German, letter Z is pronounced as T, and CH is H. So Zurech is Zurich. Zurich. Actually, Z and then U with 2 points about. uh, That's a German Ü. You pronounce it like trying to say, oh, how does that go? Let me remind myself. Ü. Ah, yes. You make your mouth as you are going to say U, but you say E. Ü. Zürich. Okay? There you go.
So when I landed back in LAX, I arrived in LA after being in Europe for 2 weeks. I thought that I had experienced culture shock when I arrived in Spain, but the reverse culture shock of going back to the US was 10 times as strong as the initial
Am I living in this shithole? Gosh!
culture shock that I experienced by going to Europe. Because I remember the first thing that stuck out to me, just being on the plane, having the window seat, and just looking outside, was seeing how spread out everything was. And when I saw that, I instantly knew the urban planning in LA is never going to be as good as it is in Valencia or Zurich. It's never going.
There you go. There's always someplace better, you know? Just like in cowboy movies. There's always a guy who's faster.
to be as good because again, you can add in bike lanes, you can add in public transit, but ultimately the city itself is just structured in an inefficient way.
So should I move to Spain now? After I just get accustomed to United States. Oh gosh, not again.
And it's so built up already that there's nothing you can really do to alleviate that issue within my lifetime. Maybe my grandchildren's lifetimes, but I won't be here to experience that. So I instantly knew, at least in terms of urban planning, the US is cooked. And again, this is before I found Not Just Bikes and realized
Mhm.
that this was by intention. Basically, the reason why American cities, especially in the South and the West, tend to be so spread out is because these cities were built after the invention of the car. And listen, I'm not one of those people who is completely averse to cars. I like cars. And honestly, as a car guy, I feel like Europe provides a better driving experience than the US because, again, the infrastructure, the roads are better. But that's a different discussion for a different day. Aside from realizing that the urban planning would never be as good in LA as it was in Valencia, which in many ways, when you consider the palm trees and the weather and the beach, Valencia felt like an alternate reality version of LA. So arriving back in LA was very strange for me psychologically because it almost felt like I was stepping into a dystopian version of Valencia, Spain, where not only was the urban planning just a complete afterthought, but also because of the very high cost of living and the overall individualist, every man for himself mentality that I will touch on here in a second, the homelessness was just out of control. And it was only then that I realized, being in Valencia, I had only seen maybe 3 or 4 homeless people in those 2 weeks. On the bus ride back from LAX to Van Nuys, which is in the north part of LA, it was maybe an hour of a bus ride. I saw more homeless encampments than I saw in my 2 weeks in
Gosh,
Valencia.
this
And I don't
is-
think I saw any homeless people in Switzerland.
that's
So
really
imagine
horrible.
in 1 hour, I've already seen probably 10 or 20 times as many
Luckily,
homeless
the weather is
people
nice over there.
because I'm seeing whole encampments on the side of the road with tents just set up everywhere than I did in Europe. And it's not like I was just in one area in Valencia. I was going around with the bicycle. I was exploring. So that really blew my mind.
That's another issue that Trump could solve. He could kind of call up National Guard and send it over there to just shoot those people, clear the streets.
Mind coming back. But then, to cap it all off, the cost of living was just astronomically high. I remember going grocery shopping for the first time. I went to Target, and the amount of money that I spent to get myself canned food, tortillas, granola, peanut butter, and bread, and maybe bananas or something like that. The amount of money that I spent on that, so basically a step up from prison food, was more than I had spent to get myself and my girlfriend groceries. And I was getting us healthy foods. I was getting us salads, fresh fruit, green juices, things of that nature. And I was spending less money for both of us. So I realized pretty quickly that, hey, maybe the US is not all it's cracked up to be. And I didn't know it in that moment, but I subconsciously made a decision that I was going to move to Europe. Now,
Okay, so you're the guy who actually caused Trump to make all of this fuss because he's trying to move things around. He saw what you reported there, and now he wants to make US better than the Europe. And now all those titty thing sucklings who are suckling on titties of today today's system are outraged. Hey, don't move out! Titties we are suckling on from away from us. What we'll have to move around to find some new titties to suckle on.
a big part of the reason why this was because my girlfriend was born and raised in Europe and lived in Europe. And I just felt like we would have a better quality of life being in Europe together than in the US together. So when my girlfriend returned to her home country of the Netherlands from Valencia, Spain, after being there for, I think it was 5 months for her internship, we started creating somewhat of a plan to get me to the Netherlands. Now, the plan was very rudimentary at the time, but just from our preliminary research, we realized very quickly that there was a direct path for me specifically to go to the Netherlands, which is where I'm filming this video right now, and that was through the DAFT visa, the Dutch American Friendship Treaty visa. Basically, this visa is for American entrepreneurs who are looking to set up shop in the Netherlands. And I said, okay, I'm going to take that visa, I'm going to use that visa because I'm already an entrepreneur anyways, and I am going to move to the Netherlands. So my girlfriend came and visited me in the US, in Texas. By this point, I had returned from LA to Texas. She visited me for around 6 weeks, and literally the day that she left, I booked my flight to the Netherlands. I booked a one-way flight. And I spent the rest of 2023 stacking up as much money as possible to sort of cushion my fall as I landed in this new unfamiliar country because I had never visited the Netherlands. I had never previously visited the Netherlands.
Netherlands is one happy little place, just like Dula Kiss, dun 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 dun.
All I knew about the Netherlands was what she told me about it and what I saw other people say about it online. So people like Not Just Bikes, for example, because when I arrived back in the US, I was curious to see why the urban planning was the way it was. And what I realized from watching Not Just Bikes amongst other people was that, again, the automotive companies had essentially lobbied politicians to pass legislation that prevented mixed use zoning. So in Europe, the way that things are structured, you're always within walking or biking distance of the things that you need. Something like a food desert is pretty much non-existent out here, at least as far as I have seen, especially here in the Netherlands. I have never seen a scenario where you are far removed from all of your basic necessities. I am in a very small Dutch town, a town of about 12,000 people, and I have no problem with biking to the gym, to the grocery store, multiple grocery stores, pharmacy, anything else that I might need. I can get there very, very rapidly within about a 5 to 10 minute bike ride. And that's being in this small Dutch town. Whereas back home in LA or in Dallas, these are very big cities with over 1 million people each. And you can't really bike to these kinds of places because the infrastructure just doesn't exist and the layout is not conducive to that infrastructure, even if people decided to build it. So, again,
Money, capitalism. There's no money in cycling around for, not much money. So bicycles are not very expensive. So nobody could make a lot of money making bicycles. But if you're driving around, if you're driving around, you have to buy an expensive truck. So then GM and Ford and all the others could make a lot of money of you. You know, strictly business, nothing personal.
now I'm hip to the fact that, hey, we're basically being scammed. We're
Except today is far, far less American vehicles on American roads and much more Asian. Yeah. So maybe US should kind of narrow up those roads that couldn't be sustained anymore. That'll be some kind of solution, but you know, there's no money in that either. So it's just a wild capitalism.
living in the shadow of corruption. And I didn't like that feeling. I didn't like the feeling of having to make car payments simply because of corruption. So, again, I booked my flight to the Netherlands. This was around August of 2023, and I booked the flight for January 2024. I spent the rest of the year stacking up my money, got around maybe 15,000, 18,000, something like that saved up, and I flew one way to the Netherlands. And I remember being on the plane in the window seat once again, and as we were descending into Schiphol, I don't know if I said that correctly, but the airport in Amsterdam, the first thing I noticed was, wow, from up here at least, the infrastructure looks even better than it did in Spain, and maybe even better than it did in Switzerland. Maybe. Big, big, big maybe on that. But once my girlfriend's family picked me up from the airport and we started driving from Amsterdam to where they lived in Noord Brabant, which was around an hour, maybe an hour and a half away, I realized, wow, the roads here are even nicer than they were in Spain. And basically, everything is kind of a step up, just infrastructure wise, compared to Spain. Because the Netherlands is kind of a more developed or advanced country. Not saying it's better, it's just more developed and more advanced. So I was like, wow, this is absolutely amazing. And as the months went on, what I realized was the Netherlands provides an unequivocally better lifestyle than the US. I had it backwards growing up, and many Americans have it backwards as well. A lot of Americans, most Americans, can't even point the Netherlands out on a map. And yet, this country, this small country, provides a much better quality of life than the US. And really, Spain and Switzerland both did as well. And I've also been to Belgium and London, albeit very briefly. We visited Antwerp and London for about a day each. And I would say that just by the metrics that I've listed throughout this video, so safety,
Oh, there you go. Glasses. Now that's why you go girlfriend and boyfriend. You wear identical glasses. I wear glasses too, but not at that age. Okay.
infrastructure, urban planning, these countries, these cities, at least in those countries, Antwerp and London, also provide a higher quality of life than anything I've seen in the US. And based on my experience, it's not the most extensive experience, but I have multiple reference points. I am comfortable now in saying that Europe provides a higher quality of life than America. And it all comes down to this one thing because these are all very different countries with very different cultural customs. but there's one common denominator between all of them. And I imagine this extends even to the European countries that I haven't visited.
Let me guess. They are tribal. Those countries have tribes living in them and they feel connected, unlike United States where everybody's for himself.
And that is the collectivist mentality. The collectivist mentality is what informs the infrastructure. It informs the safety. It informs the urban planning because everything is catered to the group rather than the individual. You see, the United States of America is a very individualist country. I'm not saying it's the only individualist country, but it might be the most individualist country. Rugged individualism, so to speak. That is not just an empty stereotype.
That works best for capitalist class.
It's true. In fact, I would regard myself even as an individualist in many ways because you have to be an individualist to not only decide to be an entrepreneur and talk to a camera for a living, go against the beaten path in that regard, but also to take your entrepreneurial venture and move it to a country that you've literally never visited, nor has anyone else in your immediate sphere ever visited either. That none of them could point out on a map, that none of them even know what language they speak in that country. You have to be an individualist to operate the way that I do. However, at the same time, having now lived in the Netherlands for 14 months, I've come to realize that collectivism and individualism are not mutually exclusive. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, collectivism, in my eyes, once meant conformity. I always thought of collectivism as this societal need to conform, to follow the beaten path, to do what everyone else does. In fact, in the Netherlands, they have this saying, do normaal. And that's only part of the saying, so I might be using it out of context here. But I think that the way a lot of people perceive it is act normal, because that's the literal translation. Act normal. If you're acting normal, you fit in to Dutch
Especially if you are crazy. Just act normal and nobody will notice.
society. And as long as you're not going against the grain or stepping off of the beaten path, then you are welcome here. But if you're not, then you're not welcome here. You need to leave. For a while, that's how I perceived do normal as well. I thought that the collectivist mentality meant that I had to do what everyone else was doing. But over time, what I realized was that being in a collectivist society actually enables individualism. It enables a new level of individuality because you have the support system to back you up if things go wrong. The collectivist mentality gives people the means to actually take these risks and go against the beaten path because you know that you have a strong safety net to catch you if you fall. When I landed in the US, in LA, and I was on the bus going back to my car, seeing those tent encampments on the side of the road, it served as a brutal reminder that the people who step off the beaten path in the US and fall flat on their faces have nothing to break their fall.
So let me see your comments now in a couple of years once Europe goes into war frenzy. Two tribes go to war when two tribes, and they give you a kind of they call you up on arms. Let's see how in order to kind of defend the tribe. Yeah. So let's see how your opinion will hold at that time. Okay, that was all. Thank you guys. Bye.